Good afternoon. This is the WPI Collective Learning Meeting, CLM. Today is November 8th. We're joined by Jim Thompson. And Jim has joined us as a special guest today to talk about his career, both practically with clients and some of the methodological issues he's experienced in system dynamics. Let me pull up real quick. He first got introduced in system dynamics with Jay Forrester in the 1970s. He attended MIT in the early 90s and got a PhD at Strathclyde in 2009 at the young, tender age of 63. So it shows that it's never too late to get a PhD, which is good for me, being an older student as well. His thesis explored how and under what conditions clients learn in system dynamics. He's done work all over the place. So the U.S. Government Accountability Office, that's the part of the government that oversees the rest of the government, World Bank, in the United States, in Europe, over in Asia, World Health Organization, just all sorts of stuff. And healthcare has been his primary focus, so we'll probably get a lot of insights on healthcare today. And he's also collaborated with projects with some of the names that we recognize: Jack Homer, Alan Graham, Nathan Forrester, Bob Eberlein, and Jim Hines. So this is going to be an interactive session. We did publish a short outline, but that's kind of a notional outline. And what we're going to do is have Jim go through a couple topics. I got a few questions, but please, if you have a question, feel free to interject and ask, because we want this to be an interactive dialogue. So with that, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you want to start off with a brief introduction and kind of what brought you into system dynamics.
Yeah, Oleg encouraged me to start with that, probably because it's a story. It might be a little funny. I was a classically trained accountant and CPA. I worked for Arthur Andersen for a number of years, 6 years or so, and left there to go be kind of a jack of all trades accountant in the corporate office of at that time, technology company that was growing in fits and starts. And we were kind of a funny group of people. We had 25 people in the corporate office total, and we had no operating divisions that were right around us. There were things like 45 or 50 miles away. So we were just a little collection of people, and we had different jobs, and sometimes I'd have to change hats very quickly. So one of my jobs was to gather information for the annual planning meeting. And so I would go to Data Resources or Chase Econometrics or one of the big analytical shops at the time and get their perspectives on forecasts for the national economy for the next few years. Along the way, I was made an authorized check signer, which was kind of a big deal. Again, it was a 25-person office, and there were, I think, 3 or 4 people who could sign checks. And this is back when we used to have paper checks and people sign them. And I was working late one evening, and the president of the company came in, and as was his custom, put his feet up on my desk and handed me a check that was made out to J.W. Forrester. And it was a rather substantial amount of money. At that time, it was probably more than I was getting paid per year. So my eyes lit up, and he asked me to sign the check. And I said, well, I'd be happy to. You have to have a package, a voucher package. So like, what's this for? And, invoice and bill of lading and all of that stuff. And he said, no. He said, this is for old Jay's up at MIT wumping up a model of the national economy. So I paused for just a moment. But you should understand, I've always been brash. At that time, I was the definition of brash. So I said, well, Bob, there are lots of models of the national economy. I said, I've got stuff here from DRI and Chase and a bunch of other outfits that we put together for the annual planning meeting. Tell me about this. So he said, Jay is, into this thing. And I believe it was just being called system dynamics at that time. This was about 1975, say, or 74. And so Bob was an engineer, And he did his best to explain to me what system dynamics was. So this went on for, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And I said, Bob, that kind of sounds like a lot of BS. So Bob being the way Bob was the definition of brash for the older generation, if I was the definition for the younger generation at the time. So he said, you're just the guy I want. He said, you take this check up to MIT and have Jay explain to you what he's doing. And he said, if you understand it, leave the check. If you don't understand it, bring it back. So I said, okay, fair enough. So before I actually went up to MIT, I had made the appointment pretty quickly the next day, but I was talking with Bob's secretary. This was back when people had secretaries too. And she was also the receptionist for the office. And she said, Bob worships Jay Forrester. So I thought, okay, he's getting the check whether I understand it or not, that's for sure. So got in the car the next day, drove up to MIT and met with Jay for, it was probably more than 2 hours. And he did his level best to explain to me what he was doing and why he was doing it. I had no idea what he was talking about. Everything just went right over my head. I gave him the check, thanked him very much, and left. So that was my introduction to system dynamics. I had no idea what he was talking about in the national model. The concept of feedback was meaningless to me, but it was certainly intriguing. And so when I came back, Bob said, oh, Jay was really impressed. I don't know with what, but anyway, he said, so I want you to go back, and there were semi-annual, what they were called sponsors meetings. Actually, at that time, there were only 2 sponsors, EG&G and the company I worked for, Cole Morgan. We were the only people who were sponsoring it. And so I would go up in, I think it was May and October, every 6 months, and they would put on a little dog and pony show for us about what was going on in the development of the national model. And that was my introduction to system dynamics. Over the next 17 years that I did that, I guess, well, who cares? It was 16 years. I got more and more intrigued, and we hired Peter Senge and Jenny Kemeny, and gosh, there was quite a troupe. I don't remember all the names off the top of my head now. Michael Goodman, and they would come down and help us with various problems that we were having that were, clearly systemic. So I got a pretty good dose of it over the years, in addition to the national model. And when I left the company was taken over in 1990. And when I left there, I got not a handsome payout, but it was enough to, keep dinner going for a while. And I found a job in the area that was kind of interesting, but didn't take all of my time. And so I said, I am going to try to go back to school and learn how to do this. And so I called Jay at home, and he was nice enough to help me get into the Sloan School. That was in a November, in I guess 91, and he helped me get into Sloan for the beginning of the January semester in 1992. So that was it. And then when I left there, I went with Jim Hines. Jim and I had a little, well, it was a 2-person company that we call Leap Tech. We had a couple of employees over the years. excuse me. And we did the work for the GAO, and that was really our first work together. We worked for a company up in Cambridge by the name of Lotus, which I don't even know if that name is still around, but it was pretty prominent back in the early 90s. And one thing led to another. Jim went back to teach, and I couldn't compete with that. So he went back to MIT to teach, and I kind of went off on my own and worked for either myself or other consulting firms for a few years, and got into the swing of working with clients.
So if you, following on that, when you've obviously got a ton of experience with different clients, a lot of different insights over time. What was system dynamics to them, right? What did they use it for? What was its concept to them? Did you ever get put in the position that you were put in with Jay, where you had to explain to someone what this is and, get them to understand how it would be used?
I think I would tend to focus on the more problematic situations, which were frequent, where a boss would order some work to be done, some significant work to be done, and we'd be put in with a team of people who had no appreciation whatsoever for system dynamics, and they would want to learn what is it that makes this different, and what are we trying to do. And those were often, especially at the beginning when I was very prescriptive personally. I was the treasurer of a big company, and now I was put into a consulting role. I didn't know how to do consulting. I was very poor at it, and so I would tell people and then sort of dismiss their questions. I would tell them what was on my mind at that time. Not a good thing to do. And then I kind of swung the other way and developed a package of reading material. And, most of these guys were like marketing or finance people, and they found it very demanding to be given a stack of paper to read that probably they had no foundation in. So it's always been a tough assignment to explain what system dynamics is to someone who is not terribly interested in it. They just want to get their problem solved and on to the next thing. That's always been demanding. I can't say that I got a lot better, but apparently I did, because I managed to, get new clients and things like that as time went on. But it was a very painful process for me to explain it.
What were some of the principal questions that you would walk through with the client, or that you would try and explore through? Prediction, prescription, what do we want to know better? What was some of that like?
A lot of times, let's take like every pharmaceutical model I think I ever did. It was with a marketing group, a group of people in marketing who were typically able to, first of all, they were all very intelligent and deeply interested in what they were doing. So terribly engaged with it. And typically they were having a problem that they really didn't understand. They were working on a problem where everything that they had done in the past that should have worked was either failing or not meeting grade. And so we were kind of looked at as like the court of last resort. Like, we're going to bring in these guys because they're sharp, they're real smart, and they're going to help us solve this problem. And so that was very typically the client group in pharmaceuticals. Also, they virtually all had a good background in healthcare economics. And so econometrics was their first tool, or their tool of choice. And when you walked in saying, well, let's try something significantly different, and we're going to, use this perspective to look at that problem that you're dealing with, a lot of times the pushback was huge.
Jim, this is Fred Kautz. I'm curious, in your consulting engagements, were you doing what most of us understand to be group model building, in the sense that they were actually in on the beginning of the model build, or did you present something already sort of half constructed and then go from there?
I would say I've done both, and the group model building that is written, as it's written up by Jack Venix and John Moorcroft, in my experience, is rare. I have no doubt that they did what they said they did, but typically people were not terribly interested in getting to the level of problem solution where they would go through literally stepwise every facet of the system dynamics model building methodology. And that often meant people coming on board or leaving the engagement. And so the consultant, me, or me and a colleague, or me and three colleagues, would often be left with the problem and sort of the environment or atmosphere that it was our model and not the client's model. That's very frequently been the case, to the point that I've never given up on the idea of group model building, but I modify it dramatically, in that unless we have a team in which there are people who are willing and able and do write equations with us, group model building is really a very, very tough environment for a consultant.
With these consultings, C's, and looking at the modeling you're describing, where you're kind of handed a problem and you're working with stuff, in what circumstances would you use large models, and what circumstances would you use small models? Do you have any insights on how to sort of, that's the eternal question, how big a model do you need? How small a model do you need? Do you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, Jim, I had lunch a week ago with Jim Hines and Bob Eberlein, and we were talking about just that topic, because I said, it's very near and dear to my heart, and my attitude has changed so dramatically over the years. You have to excuse me for just a moment. I'm losing my voice for some reason.
Go get a drink.
Yeah.
For everyone online, thanks. I saw Martha and Hamid join. Thank you for joining. It's going to be an interactive session, so if you do have any questions or anything like that, like you heard Fred, just feel free to jump in and ask. If your microphone's not working, you don't have one, put it in the chat box. We'll see it and get to it.
Sorry about that. I think it has something to do with the time of the year. Turn cold real quick. The justification for a large model is typically prediction. And there's sort of a faith or a belief that a large model will do a better job of predicting than a small model will do. And people want more and more detail. And when they see their detail in the model, they feel more comfortable until their detail in the model doesn't do what they expected it to do. Then the discomfort level rises very rapidly. The
Could you elaborate on that? What's an example of that?
Let's see. You can do a pretty good model for a pharmaceutical in under 100. One can do a pretty good model for a pharmaceutical marketplace in under 100 equations, typically. And I don't want to say that there's a generic model that sort of fits all pharmaceuticals. That's definitely not true. But the more elaborate the model is, you find that the dynamics simply don't change. There are huge forces in the pharmaceutical marketplace that will determine the position of any drug, any offering. And overcoming those with more effort in one area or more effort in another area typically is not even possible. Once the drug is sort of defined, the molecule is defined, you know the marketplace. And so once we have the characteristics of the molecule and its position in the marketplace, we can pretty strongly say this is what's going to happen. And it doesn't take a huge amount of detail to get there. What you really have to understand is how attractive this product is going to be relative to the competing therapies. And having said that, the marketing departments will often look for a significant amount of detail based upon geography and based upon the number of customers that they believe to be in any geographic area. And I found that precision typically does not enhance the quality of the forecast.
Would you keep this structure in the model from a change management perspective so clients could see it was in there even though it made no difference? Or would you show it to them, show how it had no effect, and then remove it?
The former. That is, I would leave it in. Maybe that was always a mistake. I don't know. But we would leave it in. And but then when we would go to things like the executive summary, we'd work very hard with the marketing executives to not talk about the detail and to talk about the dynamic, the loops that had the most influence.
That leads to a question from Jeff, I think, on that topic. He's saying, so this is more of the system thinking piece as opposed to sort of the structural dynamics, correct? And Jeff, if I've got your question wrong, please correct me. He's on the chat here.
Yeah.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, Jeff, we can.
Hi, thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Jim. So I'm an alum of WPI System Engineering program. I am much more in the camp of the importance of system thinking as opposed to not necessarily the modeling. So all my questions will be with that kind of perspective. So what I heard you say is you can build these very large dynamic system models that have a lot of equations that talk about how that molecule, use the drug example, how that molecule will, be accepted in the community, what the profit margin will be, blah, 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 all of that. But thinking about how you get there, being able to draw those conclusions from the model is more, to me, the system thinking piece of it. I mean, the tool just doesn't say, here's the answer. You've got to be able to use the model and what it produces and then infer something from that, right? And to me, that's always the secret sauce.
I think my practical approach to that evolved over time to where I would say this is as far as we should go with the system dynamics methodology. And you guys can take it over. You know, once we've identified what the important loops are and what the important variables are, you guys can go to town with your various analytic methodologies and sharpen the parameter estimates or cascade the detail. You don't need another system dynamics model. You don't need a more elaborate system dynamics model. You don't need one for every marketplace. If you want it, of course, we're always happy to do it. But you really don't need it, because unless you're going to adopt system dynamics as an in-house technical capability, why not just use your analytic groups as they currently exist? That's played pretty well.
So there's a question from Martha here, going back to clients who are not used to thinking in equations. You talked about how you would have to kind of, they're just not used to thinking in that terms. How did you approach that situation from a consulting standpoint?
We typically wanted somebody on the team, on the client side of the team, who was respected for their mathematical talent, capability. And we would ask them to explain things in corporate jargon or company language on our behalf.
Mm-hmm.
That also worked pretty well.
So find an ally in the firm who can translate. One of the topics, and I don't know if this came up in pharmaceuticals, but you talk about dynamic equilibrium as being one of your favorite topics. Can you kind of explain what your view is on dynamic equilibrium and how it comes up in these engagements, and maybe give an example of a engagement where it came up?
Yeah, I'm not the world's greatest modeler, even though I've been struggling with it for 25 something years here. And what I find is that I make mistakes when I'm writing the model. I'll do things quickly. I'll do it at night, whatever it might be. There's going to be a mistake in that model, or more than one. And if I go in and start calibrating the model to data right away, you'll never find that mistake. I can take a pretty bad model and get it to simulate data. I think we all can, and you just never, or at least I would never find the error until it was way too late. And what I found was that if I build, first of all, I sectorize models almost always, and so if I treat each sector as a small model that must be in dynamic equilibrium, so that when I test it, I have an expectation, a very precise expectation of the response of that sector, I build confidence in my model, and the likelihood of me writing something backward is hugely reduced. I'm not saying that the models don't have mistakes in them, but I suspect that it's been hugely reduced, and I typically will find it when I'm trying to find the initial equilibrium for a stock. So it's been a kind of a passion of mine. I've worked with a few grad students over the years, outside of WPI, typically at Bergen, where that's not an imperative in their coursework, and really opened some eyes as to the value of that. The other thing is finding an analytic equilibrium. Just that process, even when I do it in kind of a rote mechanical way, which I sometimes will do, where I'm just focused on, let's just do the algebra here and get the thing done. I will often think of how inappropriate my representation is. I can't explain it anymore. I can find dynamic equilibrium. The model is correctly formulated, but now I don't believe that this sector adequately represents what I wanted to do. I somehow lost my way in the model building process. And so that whole process of finding dynamic equilibrium gets me to focus on each variable and definitely on the constants. Why is this a boundary of the model? Why did I stop it here?
Staying on equilibrium as a topic, we had last week we had Jay Forrester as a guest in here via video lecture he gave at MIT in the 90s. So we were watching one of his video lectures, and he commented on equilibrium because a lot of his models don't start in equilibrium. They start sort of in motion. And his view was that it depends if you're looking at the short mode or the long mode, and whether you need to see behavior that only occurs over the long mode. If you start in equilibrium, that may not materialize.
Right.
What's your view on that, or comment, or addition to
that? I think I would have to hear Jay.
I'm a poor translator of Jay.
That's okay. That is, I would have to hear more of the context to be able to respond adequately to it. But just overall, Jay may have been coming, that comment may have arisen in an era when the burden on computers was much greater than it is now. The computational burden of a system dynamics model in 1975 was huge relative to the machine. Now, it's like a joke.
It was the market growth.
Also, I think the point there is that the dynamic equilibrium that Jim is talking about is a hypothetical
initial.
It does not represent the dynamics over time, which might actually be experienced in a system. So if you disturb that system using any kind of disturbance, then you would see the dynamic behavior that has actually been experienced. I would agree with Jim that trying to beat that hypothetical equilibrium condition actually will bring out all the anomalies that you might have otherwise programmed in the model. So when I was reenacting, for example, Jay's urban dynamics model, it does not start in equilibrium. I put that model in equilibrium. Then I made a step change in what was it? The construction rate, some construction rate. It generated the behavior that Jay points towards. So for me, it's also a way to understand that hypothetical condition is a way to remove any anomalies that might have put in. Also, a reference condition, a point of reference, if you want to understand the dynamic behavior that's totally endogenously generated. Then a little bit of external input would invoke that behavior. So on the other hand, if you did not start from equilibrium, then you don't know what is being endogenously generated by the model and what's coming out of some coincidental input that you might have created.
We've got a follow-on from Jeff here. Can any problem be modeled that will reach dynamic equilibrium? That is, how much complexity can you model and still expect to find analytical equilibrium?
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say I'll give you one story, and it's probably it's actually meant to be more of a joke than anything, but it does illustrate it. Speaking of precision, we had 108 management initiatives, different programs scheduled at Cigna when I was the director of economic analysis there. And the problem that I was given was to build a model and to predict the effect on each client. So there were over 9,000 clients, and there were 108 different management initiatives in everything from mailroom efficiency to claims processing, insurance claims processing. And so it was a hugely complicated situation. And people wanted to know, well, if we apply this management initiative to this client in November of next year, what will the impact be? It was literally that silly a situation. But I said, I get the check every week. That's what they want. That's what I'm going to do. I mean, I tried everything to get out from underneath that, and nope, that's what we want from you. So I built the model, which the basic model was 10,000 equations. And that's big enough. And then when we added all of the complexity, the complication of the various clients and all of the management initiatives, it ended up being 3.2 million equations. That was in dynamic equilibrium. So how big can it be and still be in dynamic equilibrium? Did I really put 3.2 million equations into dynamic equilibrium? Yeah, I guess so, but maybe 10,000 was enough. I can't even remember the number of stocks in that model. It was huge. It took me a year to write the model and to put it into equilibrium.
Yeah, what I want to say in response to Jeff's question was that, if there are a lot of feedbacks in the model, negative feedbacks in the model, it will be more difficult to bring it into equilibrium. The way I have done it with complex models is to specify the initial values of stocks as relationships. So you can use, for example, Little's law to create a computation for the initial value of stocks that depends on the outflow and the time constants. And if it's in equilibrium, outflows will be equal to inflows, so it will be inflows to that time constant. So you can specify the initial values computationally, and then you can often change the parameters, and the equilibrium of the model will be maintained. So Jim he's done this tremendous job of putting this very big model in equilibrium. It's difficult as the model gets bigger, but there's no limit to it, I feel.
I can sort of add in just recent experience. The ISIS model is now up to about 600 equations with about 5 subscripts in one dimension and 2 in another, and it was initially started by an instance, right? It had data in it. Moving it to equilibrium was most of the summer for me, but it did flip out a lot of errors and anomalies I wouldn't have otherwise seen because they were buried in the initial conditions I had put in it. So now it starts in equilibrium, but you can put in your own scenario if you want and kind of parameterize it. But I think the advice of, even if it's not required to be in equilibrium, getting it into equilibrium can help identify many of these things and improve the model.
And if you can specify the initial conditions as computations, then it gives you the freedom to change parameters.
That was a big learning lesson. Instead of everything being just the number you input, it's a computation of different things in the model to create the image. So it's very few changes then.
Yes.
It can get a little annoying, but I typically put switches in, and so I have a initial equilibrium, and then I will switch over to data. And that's especially important in population models. because population models will almost always give you a very unrealistic perspective on the population. And equilibrium is probably a meaningless, well, it's meaningful in that it highlights for people, if you were ever to achieve this, this is what your society would look like. But it's almost laughably difficult to figure out how you could ever do that. You know, even with small countries like working in Singapore, it was a very unrealistic state. It was important for me, for the models that we were building, to know that I was using a population sector that was in equilibrium. But then we'd immediately switch over to live data as the initial condition, and then see how our model did against demographic models, say.
Yeah, I think these scholars historically, like the traditional economists, have presented equilibrium as a conceptual situation, although we would never get there. John Stuart Mill had the idea of stationary state. Ricardo thought of an equilibrium, which was precipitated by his two laws, the iron law of wages and the law of diminishing rents. And these equilibria did not exist when they proposed their mental models, but these were concepts.
Couldn't it also be said, the way you described earlier, that putting in equilibrium is often easiest to do when you use ratios and relative levels, that equilibrium itself does not mean everything's still, but those ratios are being maintained at the same level as dynamics occur. So that's the
it's a dynamic equilibrium. In every stock, there is a turnover, but the inflow balances the outflow. So it's, in other words, which is used as homeostasis, which is really a dynamic equilibrium.
We still have an ongoing bet on homeostasis, if I recall from your class. Let's talk.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, go ahead. I saw Jeff had one question. Oops, his chat. Sorry. I have a question. You want to know if a model can reach equilibrium, is that an indicator that the model is correct?
Not necessarily. Okay. It means that there are no anomalies in consistencies. It may not mean that you have all the structure that is needed in the model. It may not really say much about the boundary, system boundary.
Right.
But whatever you have is internally consistent.
Okay. Then I'll throw in my question. So I want to go back to some of the earlier conversation around the pharma. Some of your work with the pharma in the industry. So you have a company that's working on a molecule, and they get some indications of the molecule and what the molecule can do, the therapeutic benefit. So I didn't understand what types of challenges you were helping them address. Were you looking at a competitive landscape? Because you kind of mentioned that, where they might have some kind of a therapy that is beneficial, but then there's another company that's the competitor that has something similar. How would you help them in that competitive landscape? Is that what you were trying to do, or could you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, I mean, assignments were always very different, but one particular one related to the HIV/AIDS marketplace, and it was before protease inhibitors, which were mid-90s invention, before those came to market. So it was wide open. There was nothing even approaching a cure, and the existing drugs were very difficult for the patient to use, bad side effects and whatnot. And so we worked with a pharmaceutical company, and their concern was they knew what was in the R&D pipeline of other companies, and they had a sense of what the characteristics or attributes of those drugs would be. And they had a very good sense of what their drug was. And so the question was, if we put a significant amount of money into the research budget, we could accelerate the approval of our drug. And how much would primacy, being first to the market with a really good drug, how much would that pay back to us versus following the course that we're currently on, which would delay the introduction, would slow the introduction, wouldn't delay it. It was a relatively slow process to gain approval. And so that was a very, very interesting challenge. Also, that just to tell you about the real world, their marketing department had come up with a forecast of a hockey stick. And it was a funny looking hockey stick because it almost went straight up. And so we pointed out that this implied a certain number of patients that exceeded the population of the United States. And we didn't think that everyone would be infected that quickly. And that kind of put us at odds with the marketing department, but what can you do? You know, that's what their forecast was. So it created we had to tiptoe. One approach was to tiptoe around and to say very little about it. And the other approach was to just kind of confront it. We chose the latter. We confronted it.
So just one quick follow-up question on this. So you were, as you're relating your story, you described that there was some insight into the competitors, because I know the competitors have to make some, because they have to submit information to the regulatory body, so you get some insight into the efficacy and safety and the various things. But you still have somewhat incomplete information that you're using. So how do you handle it? Because obviously, your client can give you more inside information. So you have like a model where you can populate it with more representative data or information versus you still have a little bit of clouding of information on the other side. How do you account for that?
Well, I think one of the big values that we brought in that engagement was to show them where to put their marketing research. They had obviously a limited amount of money to spend on marketing research. And we said, if we could find out more about these specific attributes, we could probably tell you more about the value of your product. And so that was a big benefit to them.
I want to follow up on that with, I kind of previewed up front that this may come up, but there's been the discussion in society of what makes a quality model, what makes a good model a bad model. You kind of put that in your outline of the differences between good and bad models. So I guess getting this discussion of the hockey stick, you confronted that. But what in your mind makes a good model versus a bad model? And how does that relate with output and history?
The ability to predict is, Jay would always call it a fool's errand. Having said that, we have an insatiable appetite for prediction in the marketplace. A model that reproduces history adequately, we rely on for its testimony. We say, well, it's never lied to us in the past, therefore its future prediction must be accurate. And that's not true. And so there are hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of models because we all carry around a model in our head. So we know that there are about 7 billion mental models active right now, making predictions as to, certain things. In the field of formal models, it gets a lot smaller, but you can get a really crummy model because it ignores everything that's going on around you. And, it's the old joke about the model for predicting milk production that doesn't have any cows in it. The econometric models that will predict milk production without saying, here are the number of cows. I don't know if that's ever been true, but there are lots of market models out there that simply ignore the competition or that ignore competing therapies when the focus is, well, we make a device or we make a pill, and so therefore all we consider to be our competition are other pill makers or other device makers. That simply isn't true.
Do you find that reliance on that type of data goes back to some of the econometric, that a lot of these models use statistics, so they're using correlated information versus system dynamics using calculus, and therefore causal is important. Do you find that being what's the root cause of that?
Well, precisely that, and that is that, and we've all seen the cartoon of the guy looking for his keys under the street lamp, and why are you looking here? Because it's light here, but I may have dropped the keys in the dark. I don't know. You use what you're familiar with, and you use what you know, and in a lot of instances, people will go back to the data that they're familiar with and try to make a projection off of that data. And as Jim Hines and I showed in the GAO work in the early 90s, what was wrong in the US housing market wasn't apparent in the econometric models that were being used at that time. It had to do with the lowering of credit standards. And we said, there's a limit, you can only lower them so far. We don't know what that magic number is. But unless you consider the lowering of credit standards, you're going to misestimate defaults. And so what we said was the government-backed enterprises, the GBEs, were likely to lower credit standards because that was the only lever that they had to move to compete. They would keep lowering credit standards to the point where they would accumulate a huge number of credit defaults, and the bubble would burst. That happened a few years later.
Actually, I have an article that appeared with one of our colleagues, the housing market crash. One of the key reasons was lowering the credit standards.
Well, I want to be respectful to everyone's time and give Jim final concluding comments. So real quick, are there any last questions to ask from online or in here? Questions for Jim?
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, this is Fred. I'd be interested in Jim's perspective on the path to the PhD and its value in the system dynamics world, consulting or otherwise.
It's unfortunate, but to become a good modeler, it really takes years, and it takes a lot of trial and error on the part of the individual, the learner, whether you're a student or not. Even as a practitioner, and I've never found an adequate substitute for it. A book that you could read, or a course that you could take where you could really shortcut that. And one of the values of a PhD in my book is the intense effort, the obsessive effort required to complete and to be able to explain your thoughts from almost every perspective. From a consulting perspective, I think it helps you. It's nice to have the label, but I think it's really valuable to have had the experience of rigorously defending what you have done, and I don't know a substitute for that. In the process, if you're getting a PhD in system dynamics, you undoubtedly are building at least one really good model, and you have understood every aspect that you can possibly, cram into your head in that process, and that's extremely valuable in dealing with clients because you learn your limitations. And what I've found over the years is that we live in a community where if you reach out for help, you'll get it. And I've liberally reached out for help over the years with my colleagues. It helped me to learn an awful lot that way. And so the PhD process, now my PhD is in management science, and it has to do with learning from models. So I really had to rely on a lot of different consultants over the years to get their experience of working with clients, but that's a different story.
So we've got the last question. I'm going to frame this in a way that also lets you answer this and then flow into sort of your concluding remarks, whatever they may be. Looking ahead, where do you see what's next for SD methodology? And then, following on that, any concluding remarks you have overall to share with us?
The attempts to automate things that we do in software have, I hate to say that it's failed, but it's come up way short. I have pleaded with the Vensim and IC people. I've never used PowerSim or any of the other competing software, so I can't speak to those. But with Vensim and IC, isn't there a way? I've given you some algorithms here for putting stocks into equilibrium. Isn't there a way that we could take all of these steps and put them into a program to automate the process of finding dynamic equilibrium in a model? And the answer has been no. I have to do the algebra on my own. I think if we had that, it would make my life easier. I don't know that it would make it any better, unless it would also pop up all of the things that I find in the process of doing that. The field seems to have gone more and more towards predictive modeling and towards very large models. And my feeling is that when you're sitting with someone who is not interested in being a system dynamicist and just wants a solution to their problem, if you can give them a very small model that has just the essential dynamics that are important to make the point, whatever that point might be, that is the value. And I think that that's what Jay talked about in the 58 article, Industrial Dynamics. We're not trying to model the world. We're not trying to model the system. We're trying to model a problem. And once we've identified that problem, it may take us a big model to get there. I'm not saying, there's no value to them. But once we do, and we've identified certain key relationships and feedbacks that are either causing the problem or creating the opportunity, we should be able to summarize that in a very small model and use that as the foundation for explanation to the client.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour, which is the end of our usual CLM. I'd like to thank everyone. Ultimately, I think, 13 people online plus 5 in the class here, so it's a good thing. This will be posted up on YouTube, and I wanted to give a very warm thank you to Jim for joining us today. We're going to ask for maybe, I'll do a follow-up email and ask for any of these, if there's any papers or readings on some of these, like the housing crash and some of this previous work. We have a Facebook where we can share these out and get them off to people, so I'll follow him on that and then share those out to the SD like him. But otherwise, thank you, Jim, very much, very much.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks for your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're now going to stop the recording, but the video will keep going.